All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah, that book that, makes you rethink everything.
Exactly. We're going deep with your notes so listeners can jump right into those aha moments.
These notes are intense. So much to unpack.
Not just summarizing, though, right?
Yeah.
We're pulling out the connections that make you go, whoa, never thought of it that way. And to help us, well, we have our expert guide. You're amazing at making complex ideas, well, relatable.
Happy to help. Harari's all about those big questions, perfect for this kind of deep dive.
Okay, let's jump in. You've probably seen the headlines. Liberalism seems to be, well, struggling.
Yeah.
But Harari argues it's more than just a rough patch. It's a full-blown crisis of faith in the whole system.
And he ties that crisis not just to the economics, but to this, deeper need for order and meaning.
Hmm.
After fascism and communism fell, liberalism seemed like the winner.
Right, like end of history, all that.
Exactly. But now some people are disillusioned with globalization, the inequality, and others are drawn back to the old ways, the hierarchies, the tradition. It's a global thing, this shift.
Which brings us to those headlines about Brexit. The rise of, well, certain political figures, nationalist parties popping up everywhere. It makes you wonder, is this it for liberalism? Or is it just changing, adapting?
The million-dollar question, right? Harari doesn't give a simple answer, but he lays out the forces at play. He points out that liberalism's past successes might have made it complacent, less able to change with the times.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit, talk about technology. It's shaping everything, obviously, and Harari really digs into its power to disrupt, more than just cool
That
gadgets.
goes there, yeah. He explores those what-if scenarios with AI and biotechnology. Like, AI could cause mass unemployment as it starts to outperform humans in more and more jobs.
It's a bit wild when you think about it. AI, driving trucks, diagnosing diseases, even composing music, both exciting and a bit scary now.
Absolutely. And where Harari's analysis gets really interesting is this merging of infotech and biotech. It could give us the ability to manipulate people in ways we've never seen before. Think about AI reading human emotions to predict and influence behavior. It's getting into, Black Mirror territory.
Yeah, it's giving me Black Mirror vibes for sure. Is that slippery slope real, or is Harari being a bit too pessimistic?
He's definitely raising some red flags.
Yeah.
He wants us to think about the ethics. But, he's not saying these things are inevitable. It's more like he's highlighting the potential pitfalls so we can start asking tough questions, now, while we still have time.
Instead of getting lost in the what-ifs, maybe the real question is, how do we make sure technology is used for good? How do we avoid those dystopian outcomes?
That's the challenge he's putting forth. Think about the long-term consequences, personally and as a society. What values should guide tech development? What safeguards do we need? Questions we should all be asking.
Okay, moving on to something Harari calls the knowledge illusion. He argues that we tend to overestimate how much we understand, like relying on experts and summaries without really grasping the complexities ourselves, kind of like living in this illusion of being well-informed when really we're barely scratching the surface.
He turns the whole idea of expertise on its head, highlighting the paradox. We accept conclusions without really knowing the how or why, which makes us vulnerable.
Especially in this age of information overload, right? With social media, news feeds, all of it, it's easy to get trapped in echo chambers.
Echo chambers, yeah.
Ugh.
A room full of your own voice, basically. That's what happens online when we only see what confirms our beliefs. It reinforces our biases, makes critical thinking hard.
Almost like being brainwashed, whether it's algorithms, politicians, even our own friends. That's where the danger is, right?
Exactly. And Harari takes it a step further. He compares the knowledge illusion to religious belief. They both rely on accepting stories as truth, even without really questioning them.
Bold statement, but it makes you think, are we just replacing one set of unquestioned beliefs with another? Like, what are some things we believe that might be based on, I don't know, misinformation or blind faith?
That's a good personal question to ponder. Harari's point is to make us think about where our knowledge comes from. We should be more discerning about what we accept as true.
So how do we break out of those echo chambers? How do we become more discerning?
It's about critical thinking skills, learning to evaluate sources,
Yeah.
and being willing to challenge your own assumptions, seeking diverse viewpoints, talking to people who think differently. It's constant questioning and reevaluating.
Which leads us to our next topic, secularism. Harari thinks it's a good alternative to religion, but he doesn't shy away from its limitations.
Right, he says it sets the ethical bar pretty high. which can be tough for people to reach, especially during hard times.
Can you break that down a bit? What does setting the bar high even mean in this context?
Well, secularism, in its pure form, is all about striving for truth, compassion, rationality. But it doesn't offer easy answers or comforting stories the way some religions do.
So when things get tough, when people are looking for meaning, secularism can feel kind of, I don't know, lacking.
You could say that. And what's interesting is that Harari points out that some secular movements, like certain types of Marxism, they've actually become quite dogmatic themselves, almost like religions in their strictness.
So the movements that were trying to break free from dogma, they ended up, well, becoming dogmatic.
It's a paradox, for sure.
Mhm.
And Harari uses it to show how complex it is to find meaning without God. He doesn't give easy answers. He's more about accepting uncertainty and embracing the search for truth and compassion. It's about the journey, not just the destination.
It's a challenging message, but also kind of empowering. We have to own our beliefs and values and keep questioning and growing.
It is. Now, this might surprise you, but Harari himself practices meditation regular.
Yeah, that was unexpected. The guy's a self-proclaimed skeptic, but he meditates. And this is a historian and philosopher who deals with huge, complex issues all the time.
Right. It's interesting, and it shows how powerful meditation and mindfulness can be. Science backs this up more and more.
So how does his personal meditation practice fit into the whole message of 21 lessons?
Well, he sees meditation as this tool to navigate the craziness of modern life. It helps him stay grounded and focused with all the information overload and everything. It's about creating mental space to observe thoughts and emotions without judging, so he can approach those big topics clearly.
It's like meditation gives him that distance, that big picture view.
Exactly. It ties into his emphasis on self-awareness. To really understand the world, you got to understand yourself first.
That's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot. The crisis of liberalism, technology's power, the knowledge illusion, secularism, and even a bit about Harari's own meditation practice.
And there's so much more to this book.
So much more. If you're intrigued, come back for part 2. We'll go even deeper into Harari's insights on meaning, identity, and all those challenges we face in the 21st century.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons. We were just talking about how important self-awareness is, but now let's zoom out to the global level. Remember Harari's take on liberalism struggling? Well, he used this interesting analogy comparing our interconnected world to ancient Egyptians and the Nile River.
I'm listening, but I don't quite get the connection. Nile River, modern world, how do those fit together?
Okay, imagine you're an ancient Egyptian farmer. Everything in your life revolves around the Nile, right? Its floods tell you when to plant, its currents, how to travel, its resources. Well, everything depends on it.
Okay, I get that. It's essential.
Yeah. You might have local gods for your village, sure. But everyone knows about the big Nile god, the one controlling this life-giving force.
So is globalization like the Nile in this analogy?
Exactly. Like those Egyptians, we're realizing our fates are tied to forces bigger than our little communities, even nation-states. Global trade, climate change, technology, these are the currents shaping our lives.
And that's where it gets really interesting, right? Harari saying, just like those Egyptians shifted loyalty from local gods to the Nile god, we might need a similar shift.
He says we might need a stronger global identity, realizing we're all in this together. Not necessarily a single world government, but a change in, well, priorities, allegiances.
Instead of my country first, it's more like humanity first.
That's the gist. And this raises questions about traditional religions. Can they, with their focus on specific groups, really provide that unifying global framework?
It's a good question, one that Harari seems pretty skeptical about.
He says religions can do good, of course, but he also points out how they get tangled up in nationalism, creating divisions instead of unity. He gives some pretty powerful examples from real events.
Give me an example, I'm curious.
Well, he talks about Myanmar, mostly Buddhist. Buddhism's all about compassion, nonviolence, right? But Myanmar's got a bad human rights record. It shows even peaceful religions don't always, well, live up to their ideals.
Good intentions, but reality is more complex, right?
Exactly. Harari's not saying religion is bad, but it might not be the perfect answer for global cooperation.
So if traditional religions aren't it, and a single world government's unlikely, how do we get that global identity Harari's talking about?
That's the big question. Harari suggests we need a new story, a new way of thinking about ourselves that goes beyond nations and religions. He doesn't have an easy answer, though. It's a challenge for us to figure out.
A paradigm shift, basically. A total change in how we see ourselves and the world. A tall order, But I guess something's got to change if we're going to face these global issues.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of those challenges, Harari spends a lot of time on terrorism. He's got a view that's both insightful and, honestly, a bit unnerving.
Terrorism, it's always in the news. What's his take?
Well, he starts by saying that historically, terrorism wasn't a huge threat to most societies. It just wasn't effective enough to, like, disrupt the powers that be. Back then, even if you assassinated a king, it wouldn't change the course of history that much.
Times have changed, that's for sure. So, what's different now? Why is terrorism such a big deal today?
He says it's because we're so interconnected now, which makes us more vulnerable. Think about it. Attacking a key part of the global network, like finance or transportation, can cause huge problems everywhere. And with media and the internet, well, the psychological impact of terrorism is amplified like crazy.
It's almost like terrorism has become a kind of information warfare, using fear to create chaos.
That's a great way to put it. And here's the really interesting part. Harari says the real power of terrorism is not the violence itself, but how we overreact to it.
So, it's not just about the attacks, but the fear and paranoia they create.
Exactly. If we let fear rule, if we make decisions based on panic, terrorism wins, right? We play right into their hands. But if we stay calm, if we respond in a measured, strategic way, then we take away their power.
It's about not letting fear control us, realizing our response can be just as powerful as the attack itself.
Exactly. And then he goes even further, talking about nuclear terrorism. If a small group gets those weapons, the whole game changes. The stakes are, well, almost unimaginable.
That's a scary thought. What would that world even look like?
He paints a pretty bleak picture. Public spaces become dangerous. The threat of, like, total annihilation hangs over everything. It makes you realize how important global cooperation is to prevent that.
It sounds like he's calling for a level of international collaboration we've rarely seen before.
He is, and he knows it's tough with all the political stuff.
Mm.
But he's saying the alternative is just too terrible to think about.
Okay, so we've got liberalism in crisis, the need for a global identity, the threat of terrorism. What else is on Harari's list for navigating the 21st century?
Well, get ready for this. He tackles nationalism, and not in the way you'd expect. He really challenges our assumptions about it.
Okay, hit me with it.
He starts with history. He reminds us that for most of human history, people didn't really identify with nations like we do today. Their loyalty was to family, tribe, local community. The concept of a nation, as we know it, is pretty new.
So the whole idea of a nation is a modern thing.
Exactly, and get this. He says nationalism is basically a story, a powerful myth that shaped the world, but still a myth.
A myth? Wait, how can a nation be a myth? It's a real place, right?
He's saying nations are built on shared stories, symbols, myths that create a sense of belonging. He uses Poland as an example. You know, after it was divided up by its neighbors, it was kept alive not by governments, but by the shared culture, the stories, the songs, the traditions. That's what kept the idea of Poland alive.
So it exists as long as people believe in the story, even if there's no actual country.
You got it. And here's the interesting part. Harari says nationalism is like a contract between individuals and the state.
Okay, I'm following. What are the terms of this contract?
The individual gives some loyalty to the nation-state in exchange for protection, security, belonging. They pay taxes, serve in the military, uphold the laws, and the state promises to protect them, provide for them, represent them.
Seems like a fair deal, in theory anyway.
It can be, but like any contract, there are downsides. Harari points out how the state can become too powerful, demanding too much from its citizens, like sending them to die in wars they don't even support.
So the nation-state becomes this big thing that can override individual rights, all in the name of the quote-unquote greater good.
You got it. And that's the danger of nationalism. It can turn into blind faith, where the nation's interests are above everything, even basic human stuff.
So nationalism's not inherently bad, but it can be used for bad things.
Exactly. He's not saying get rid of nations. He's saying be critical of the stories you're told. Don't be manipulated. Remember your shared humanity.
It's about questioning the narratives, right? Recognizing that national identity is constructed, holding leaders accountable for how they use those stories.
Exactly. Then he takes a step further, saying nuclear weapons changed everything about nationalism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How did nukes change things?
He says that before the bomb, wars were bad, but they had limits. Now, with nukes, it's different. The survival of whole nations, even humanity itself, is at stake.
So nationalism went from dangerous to potentially apocalyptic.
Good way to put it. And Harari says this new reality needs a new way of thinking. one that goes beyond national interests. Global cooperation, survival, those have to be the priorities.
So is nationalism obsolete now?
It's complicated. He doesn't give a simple yes or no. Nationalism's still powerful, but it needs to be balanced with our shared humanity, our shared vulnerability, especially with threats like nuclear war.
We need to balance our national identities with our responsibilities to the whole world.
Exactly. And that's where his ideas are so relevant today. Think climate change, pandemics, technology. Global problems need global solutions.
So clinging to old ideas of nationalism, that us versus them thinking, might actually be hurting our chances of dealing with these problems.
That's what Harari's getting at. He wants us to think bigger, see beyond borders, realize our fates are linked. We sink or swim together.
It's a challenging message, especially when the world feels so divided. But it's a message we need to hear. We can't afford to ignore it.
I agree. Now, let's talk about something a little different. Truth and the whole fake news problem.
That's a hot topic for sure, especially with social media and everything. It's hard to tell what's real sometimes.
And Harari has this interesting perspective. He says humans are basically post-truth beings.
Post-truth, what does that even mean?
He means we're more swayed by stories and emotions than by facts. We believe what we want to believe, whether it's true or not.
We cherry-pick information that fits our biases and reject anything that challenges us.
Pretty much. And he makes this connection between how we get information today and religion.
Okay, this should be good. Go on.
He says for centuries, people believed stories with no basis in reality. Creation myths, gods and goddesses, miracles, the afterlife, stories that gave comfort, meaning, order to a chaotic world.
So religion is just well-told stories that people accept as truth, even without evidence.
That's his argument. And here's a link to today. He says the way we consume information online, through social media and news sites, it's similar to how people consumed those religious stories.
So we're just as likely to believe online myths and propaganda as our ancestors were to believe religious stuff.
That's what he's saying. He thinks our brains haven't evolved to handle this flood of information. We still respond to stories, emotions. We fall for biases that twist reality.
Our old brains trying to handle the digital world.
Exactly. And that's the danger of fake news. It preys on our weaknesses, makes us believe things that confirm our biases, distrust things that challenge them.
A vicious cycle. We retreat into our echo chambers, filtering out anything we don't like.
And here's the kicker. He says even if we magically got rid of all fake news, the problem wouldn't be solved.
Really? Why not? Wouldn't getting rid of misinformation make us more rational?
He says the real problem isn't the false information, but our tendency to believe it. Even with all the facts, we'd still have biases, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, all those mental traps. It's like we see the world through a filter of our own beliefs.
So it's not just about fighting fake news, but about fighting our own biases, our own tendency to believe things that aren't true.
You got it. It's about critical thinking, being more discerning, questioning our assumptions.
That's a tall order in a world overflowing with information.
It is. But Harari says it's essential for surviving the 21st century.
Okay, let's move on to another big concept, justice. Harari argues our traditional ideas about justice just aren't equipped to handle the complexities of our modern world.
He's got a point about how our sense of justice evolved. It developed in small hunter-gatherer groups where everyone knew each other. Our moral instincts worked pretty well back then. But as societies got bigger, more complex, those instincts stopped working so well.
So our moral compass isn't designed for this world.
Yeah, something like that. Think about it. We feel outrage when someone we know is wronged. But when millions are suffering across the globe, we often feel numb, powerless.
It's like our emotions can only handle so much, even if we know logically that large-scale injustice is just as bad or worse.
Exactly. And Harari adds that our focus on individual responsibility can blind us to the bigger forces that create injustice.
So it's not just about punishing bad people, but about understanding the systems that create them.
That's it. It's about recognizing that individual actions are often shaped by bigger forces, social norms, economic pressures, history.
We need to shift from blaming individuals to changing systems.
And that's one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, according to Harari. Recognizing and fighting those structural biases, even the ones we're unconsciously part of.
That's a tough one. How do we even start to dismantle something that big?
He doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He says start by acknowledging the problem. Listen to the people marginalized by these systems. Learn from them. Amplify their voices.
It's about empathy. Seeing things from other perspectives, confronting our own blind spots.
Right. And recognizing that it takes collective action, working together, to create a more just world.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in making things better. All right, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about love.
Love. Okay, this should be interesting. What's a historian and philosopher got to say about that?
Right. It seems so subjective, elusive. But Harari has a pretty interesting take on it. He starts by saying romantic love, the way we understand it, is a relatively recent invention.
So it's not this timeless, universal thing.
Exactly. He says in many traditional societies, marriage wasn't about love. It was about economics, social status, family alliances, practicality.
So marrying for love is a modern idea.
That's what he argues. And he says the shift has changed our lives a lot, for good and bad.
Okay, tell me more. How has it changed things?
Well, think about it. Marrying for love has created all these expectations about relationships. We want our partners to be our everything. Soulmates, best friends, lovers, confidants, all of it. That's a lot of pressure on one person.
It is. And it leads to disappointment. People feel like they're failing if their relationship isn't this perfect ideal.
So romantic love has a dark side.
According to Harari, yeah. He says it can be a source of both great joy and great suffering. When we put so much of our identity and meaning into a relationship, well, heartbreak hits hard.
It's setting ourselves up for a fall when we expect one person to be everything to us.
Right, and then he challenges the whole idea of what love even is.
Okay, lay it on me.
He says love isn't this mystical force outside of us. It's something our minds create, a story we tell ourselves about another person.
Love is a story.
Well, it's more complicated than that, of course. But yeah, he's saying that when we fall in love, we create a narrative about the person.
We project our own ideas onto them, making them the perfect partner in our minds.
There's definitely some of that. And he says love is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe someone is special, we treat them differently, and they act in ways that confirm our beliefs. It's a co-creation then, how we see them and how they respond.
That's a good way to put it. And here's where it gets interesting. Harari says this view of love can be freeing.
Freeing? How so?
Well, if love's a story we create, we can question the stories we've been told. We can challenge the unrealistic expectations that lead to heartbreak.
So we can be more conscious of the love stories we're telling ourselves, rewrite them if they're not working.
Exactly. It's about taking control, realizing love can take many forms. It doesn't have to fit a mold.
It's a beautiful idea. Defining love on our own terms.
Now for a heavier topic, suffering.
Yeah, not exactly lighthearted, but Harari says it's key to understanding reality and the human experience.
Most people avoid thinking about it, but he's saying we need to face it.
He's got a pretty radical view. He says suffering is the most real thing, more real than any story or ideology.
Okay, explain that. What's he getting at?
He starts by saying there's no inherent meaning or purpose to life, no grand plan. The universe doesn't work like a story.
No grand narrative, no final destination, no preset meaning.
That's the idea. He says we tend to impose narratives on reality, looking for patterns and meaning even where they don't exist.
We try to force life into a neat little box when it's actually messy and unpredictable.
Exactly. And he says that can lead to suffering.
Wait, how? If we create meaning, even if it's not real, wouldn't that make us feel better?
Maybe for a bit.
Yeah.
But Harari thinks if we believe there's some ultimate goal, some eternal essence, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. Because things change constantly, nothing's permanent. No achievement brings lasting satisfaction.
So chasing happiness makes us unhappy.
That's what he's suggesting. He says true happiness comes from accepting the present moment, joys and sorrows, all of it.
Let go of stories and ideals. Embrace the messiness of reality.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. He says suffering isn't something to avoid. It's something to embrace, to learn from.
That's a tough one to swallow. Why would we embrace suffering?
Harari says it can help us grow and change. It forces us to confront our illusions, let go of attachments, develop compassion.
It breaks us open so we can become more whole, more resilient.
I like that way of putting it. It's an idea our modern happiness-obsessed culture often misses.
So we need to see suffering as a teacher, not an enemy.
Exactly. Especially in the 21st century, with all these challenges we face.
Life is tough, and it's going to throw hard things at us. But we can still find meaning, growth, connection, even in those moments.
Right. And remember Harari's meditation practice. It ties in here.
Yeah, he's big on mindfulness. How does that connect to 21 Lessons?
He sees meditation as a way to observe thoughts and emotions without judging, accept the present, cultivate compassion.
A more mindful, present approach to life helps you weather the storms and find some peace in the chaos.
That's it. And this direct experience of reality, the good and the bad, that's what he thinks we need to navigate this century.
Embrace the whole human experience, everything.
Everything. Okay, let's get into one of the most fascinating parts of the book, consciousness.
That's a big one. Philosophers, scientists, they've been wrestling with that for ages. What does Harari add to the conversation?
Well, he challenges the idea that consciousness is only human.
You mean animals could be conscious too?
That's exactly what he's saying. More and more scientific evidence suggests that many animals, especially mammals and birds, show signs of awareness, sentience.
That's a big shift in thinking. We usually assume we're the only ones who are truly conscious, so what does this mean for us?
It makes us rethink our place in the world, our relationship with animals, our ethical duties.
If animals are conscious, it changes how we treat them, how we use them, right? We have to consider their well-being.
Absolutely. And here's where Harari's argument gets even more interesting. He says consciousness might not be an on-off switch. It might be a spectrum, with different species having different levels and types of awareness.
So it's not just are they conscious, but how conscious are they and in what ways?
Exactly. And this is where it gets really tricky. He extends this idea to artificial intelligence.
Whoa, hold on. Conscious AI, that's something else.
It is, and it raises all sorts of ethical and philosophical questions. If AI can be conscious, what are their rights? Our responsibilities? How do we even define consciousness when it comes to both living beings and machines?
It's like sci-fi becoming reality.
It is. And Harari says we need to think about these things now before AI advances too far. We need to be ready for a world where we might be sharing the planet with other intelligent beings, biological and artificial.
It's a bit daunting, but also fascinating. We're rethinking what it means to be human, facing the possibility of other intelligent beings.
Exactly. The 21st century is all about change and uncertainty. Our old stories are being challenged.
We definitely need all the wisdom and insight we can get to navigate all this. And Harari gives us plenty to think about. But we're not done yet. There's one more part to this deep dive. Welcome back. In the final part of our 21 lessons deep dive, we're focusing on something that, well, affects everyone. Education. I mean, the world's changing so fast. What are we even supposed to be teaching kids these days? Sometimes I feel like I'm barely keeping up myself.
Right. That's exactly what Harari tackles in this chapter. He says the old ways of education, the industrial age models, they just don't work anymore. We need a total rethink.
I'm all for rethinking, but what's wrong with how we've been doing things? Kids are still learning, aren't they?
They are, but he's saying they're learning the wrong things. Or not enough of the right things. You know, the traditional classroom setup, rows of desks, teacher lecturing, memorizing facts. It worked okay for factories, but the world's different now. We need different skills.
Okay, so what are those essential 21st century skills, and how do we even teach them?
Harari highlights 4 main areas: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. Those are the skills that help you adapt, solve problems, and, well, thrive in this crazy globalized world.
Those sound pretty useful for any career, not just the techie or artistic stuff.
Exactly. They can be used everywhere. And here's the thing. He says you can't teach those skills by just memorizing stuff or listening passively. It takes active learning, hands-on problem solving, applying it all to the real world.
So it's not about stuffing kids' heads with facts. It's about teaching them how to think for themselves, analyze information, ask the right questions.
Right. And Harari goes a step further. He says one of the most important things is teaching kids how to learn.
Wait, learning how to learn, isn't that like built in? We're naturally curious, right?
It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
But he says learning effectively is a skill you have to develop. It's metacognitive strategies, figuring out how your own mind works, how you learn best.
Like learning how to use your own brain.
Exactly. And when information's always changing, being a lifelong learner isn't optional. It's essential. You got to keep adapting, learning new things fast.
So we know the skills, the meta skills, but how do we actually do this? It sounds like a big change from how most schools work.
It is. Harari says we need to move away from that teacher-centered model. More student-centered, active learning, collaboration, real-world problem solving.
Paint me a picture. What would that look like in a classroom?
Classrooms designed for curiosity and creativity, where students have more control over what they learn. Instead of just passively absorbing, they're doing projects, experiments, debates. They're learning to work together, communicate, think critically.
It sounds a lot more engaging, more empowering. But we can't forget about technology, right? It's changing everything. And Harari points out some potential problems there, too.
Yeah, he's worried about AI specifically.
Yeah.
Mass unemployment, social disruption, even like challenging our sense of meaning.
Those are some serious worries. Is there anything we can do, or are we just stuck watching it happen?
Harari's realistic, but he's not giving up. He says we're not powerless. We can shape the future. He suggests a few things we can do. One is focusing on developing the skills that AI isn't good at yet.
So play to our strengths, the things that make us human.
Exactly. Creativity, emotional intelligence, critical thinking, complex problem solving, social skills, empathy, ethical decision making. Those are things humans are still better at for now anyway.
Emphasize those things that robots can't replicate, at least not yet.
That's it. Another thing he suggests is lifelong learning. If knowledge is always changing, you got to keep learning and adapting. It's more important than ever.
Like we need to be mental athletes, always training our minds.
I like that. Harari says education shouldn't stop after you graduate. It's got to be ongoing, engaging with the world.
It's not just about school. It's about being curious, wanting to learn, embracing challenges, updating your mental software.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting. He says technology isn't just changing the world out there, it's changing us, what it means to be human.
Wow, that's a big statement. How is technology changing what it means to be human?
Think about how much tech is already part of us. Our phones are like extensions of our minds. Social media is how we present ourselves to the world, and algorithms are tracking everything we do online.
It's like a hybrid world, physical and digital all mixed together.
Exactly. And he says this is just going to get more intense with AI, biotech, nanotech, all those things advancing so fast.
So where are we headed? What's the end game here? Does Harari offer any predictions?
He says a lot of these technologies are aiming to, well, hack the human system, understand and control our thoughts, emotions, behavior.
That's both fascinating and a bit scary. Sounds like we lose control, become puppets.
It does have that dystopian feel, yeah.
Yeah.
But Harari says it's not just science fiction anymore. It's getting more and more real as technology keeps advancing.
So if those dystopian futures are possible, what can we do? Are we just along for the ride?
He doesn't think so. He says the future's not set in stone. Our choices today matter. He wants us to think critically about technology, talk about the ethical stuff, and fight for policies that make sure technology serves us, not the other way around.
We need to be active in shaping the future, not just letting it happen to us.
Exactly. We have to be informed, engaged, and ready to make choices that match our values, what we want the future to be.
Now, before we wrap up, there's one last challenge Harari gives us. He says the most real thing in the world is suffering.
It's a heavy thought, especially after all these big ideas. Why end on suffering?
He's not saying we should be miserable or give up. It's about acknowledging that suffering is part of life. We all go through it. We need to face that reality, not try to pretend it doesn't exist.
So it's about acceptance, realizing that suffering connects us all.
Right. And Harari even says suffering can be a source of wisdom and compassion. It forces us to let go of illusions, attachments to things that won't last, and develop empathy for others who are hurting.
Even in darkness, there's potential for growth, change, connection.
That's a good point to end on. The world might feel chaotic, but there's still hope, beauty, reasons to keep working towards something better. And as we navigate the 21st century, well, maybe that's the most important lesson of all.